Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Roger Moseley, the Master of Selwyn College, and I'd like to welcome you here to the Ramsay Murray lecture, whether you're here with us in the Quarry Whitehouse Auditorium or joining us live or at some point in the future online. And the lecture is the latest in a series that we owe to the generous bequest of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Ramsay Murray, a loyal alumnus. Now, his brief for these lectures was, to our great pleasure, agreeably broad, in that they should be on a subject of military or historical or general interest. And we are proud of the way that in recent years we've tackled head-on some of the biggest issues of our time. Frank Gardner took us to the Middle East in 2018, we examined China with Rana Mitter in 2021, and the following year, Brexit with Anand Menon. In 2016 with Theda Skocpol, and in 2024 with Nick Bryant, we were alerted to the possibility and the implications of Donald Trump winning the American presidency. And all of these lectures were based on a deep historical understanding of their topic. Some of them are online, along with many more videos from our academic and events programme, so just search for Selwyn College Cambridge on YouTube or follow us on the social media platform of your choice. So tonight we return, at least in part, to Vladimir Putin, about whom Bridget Kendall spoke in 2015, and who has, with Donald Trump, dominated world affairs in our time. We have the perfect topic, Hitler and Putin, combining again current affairs and history, and the perfect lecturer in Professor Sir Richard Evans, who is one of Cambridge's and Britain's most distinguished historians. He's particularly known for his work on Nazism, and also for being portrayed in the film Denial, about Holocaust denial by John Sessions. Now, after his talk, my colleague, Dr. Mike Sewell, the senior tutor, will be on hand to guide you and Richard through any questions you'd like to ask about the lecture. But now let me invite Sir Richard Evans to give the Ramsay Murray lecture. Richard.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to deliver this distinguished lecture. Can you all hear me? I'm a bit uncertain as well. I should be sort of speaking in there or speaking in there, but I'm assured if you raise your hand if you can't hear me properly. So here we go. So as with the first slide, as dawn broke over East Central Europe on the 24th of February 2022, huge numbers of Russian troops entered Ukraine on four fronts: the north, east, and the south. The land invasion was accompanied by widespread aerial attacks. The prime objective was to conquer the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, which Russian armoured columns and ground troops aimed to encircle. By the 4th of March, they were in the capital's eastern suburbs. Here's a map showing the kind of entry points and the marching lines of the Russian troops. An enormous motorized column, reportedly 40 miles long, was observed moving towards the city from the north. There's an aerial drone photograph. The United States government contacted the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, and offered to help to him leave the country in safety, but the president rejected the offer and elected to stay. A Russian-orchestrated plot to assassinate him was foiled on 7th of May 2022, and in the meantime, unexpectedly strong Ukrainian resistance had halted the Russian advance. The 40-mile motorized column was dispersed and forced to withdraw. The Russians captured a number of towns and a good deal of territory in the south and east of the country, but were halted with the aid of weapons and material supplied by the United States and European countries. The Russians, it seems, had bitten off more than they could chew. The conflict essentially ground to a halt Despite the promises of newly elected US President Donald Trump to end the war within 24 hours of taking office, this year it's still going on, with ground operations continuing in the east and ongoing Russian aerial bombardment of the rest of the country, including Kiev. Here you can see how the war has progressed and ground to a halt relatively recently. How did Russian President Vladimir Putin justify the invasion? In announcing what he called the special military operation against Ukraine, he claimed that his intention was to defend Russia against the steady eastward expansion of the NATO war machine, as he called it, which had already demonstrated its aggressive intent in a long series of wars in the Balkans and the Middle East since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Here you can see how NATO has indeed expanded eastwards since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact in 1989. In similar fashion, the European Union has also expanded eastward since the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the fall of the Berlin Wall. For Putin, who spent the earlier part of his career as an officer in the Soviet Secret Service, these developments have clearly seemed threatening. This cartoon gives a new meaning to a Beatles track describing the return home of a Soviet spy, satirizing a Chuck Berry number back in the USA, for those of you who are interested in these things. In 2014, 10 years before he launched his special military operation, Putin alleged a violent coup in Ukraine had overthrown the legitimately elected government of President Viktor Yanukovych because he'd refused to support the country's proposed association with the European Union. The coup, Putin said, was followed by sham elections to confirm the overthrow of Yanukovych, then by Ukrainian genocide, his term, of the mainly Russian-speaking people of the eastern region of Donbass and the southern peninsula of Crimea. His invasion of these two regions, Putin's invasion, was launched to, as he said, stop this nightmare, I'm quoting, the genocide, he said, against the millions of people living there who rely only on Russia, only on us. And he went on, what I think is so important is to emphasize further that the leading NATO countries, in order to achieve their own goals, support extreme nationalists and neo-Nazis in Ukraine, who in turn will never forgive the Crimeans and Sevastopol residents for choosing reunification with Russia. They, of course, Putin said, will crawl into the Crimea just like in the Donbass in order to kill, just as the gangs of Ukrainian nationalists, Hitler's accomplices, killed defenseless people during the Great Patriotic War, by which he meant the Second World War. Ukraine was not a real country, he said in another speech. The Soviet government created Soviet Ukraine. This is well known to everyone, he said. Till then, there never was any Ukraine in the history of humanity. And Putin went on, Ukraine for us is not just a neighboring country. It's an integral part of our own history, our own culture, spiritual space. But he went on, it had been taken over by neo-Nazis, gangsters, drug addicts who were trying to separate it from the Russian motherland. Western elites, he said, had turned, I'm quoting here, Ukraine into their colony, into a military outpost aimed at Russia, and systematically instilled hatred and radical nationalism, fueled hostility towards everything Russian. And the invasion, he claimed, was launched to denazify the country and remove the fascist clique who had illegally seized power in 2014. And you can see here the parallels that were drawn in propaganda between Ukraine and the German Nazis, the First and Second World Wars, all the same as the military action of 2014. And all of this would be solved by turning Ukraine into part of Russia again. Well, of course, these claims are easily disproved. It was the 2014 elections in Ukraine which first, 2004 elections, which first gave Viktor Yanukovych the presidency. His election in 2004, however, was dogged by widespread allegations of voter intimidation and electoral fraud. Not surprisingly, these allegations led to massive protests in Ukraine, and the results were nullified by the Ukrainian Supreme Court, which ordered a rerun, in which victory went in what were agreed to be generally free and fair elections to the pro-Western Viktor Yushchenko. But in 2010, the pro-Russian Yanukovych returned to power, again in elections which were generally regarded as fair and free. A native and former governor of the Donetsk region, a mainly Russian-speaking industrial area in the east of Ukraine, on the border with Russia, Yanukovych began a clampdown on press freedom, jailed a prominent opposition politician, and in November 2013 withdrew Ukraine from an association agreement with the EU that had been approved by the Ukrainian parliament. He responded to mass but peaceful street protests by ordering a crackdown by the police in which nearly 100 protesters were killed. This wasn't a violent coup, then, orchestrated by the United States, as Putin claimed, but a peaceful popular protest movement met with lethal force by the pro-Russian government. Realizing his position was untenable as the mass demonstrations continued, Yanukovych fled in secret to join Putin in Russia, while the national parliament in Ukraine voted to remove him from office and pushed through the association agreement with the EU. Fresh and again generally fair elections were held, won by the billionaire pro-Western oligarch Petro Poroshenko, who continued to move the country closer to the EU, but was ousted in the 2019 elections by the anti-corruption candidate Volodymyr Zelensky, who had achieved fame and popularity by starring in a TV series in which he played a fictional Ukrainian president. In these elections, which again were generally certified as free and fair, Zelensky won an impressive 75% of the popular vote over rival candidates, the pro-Russian Yuri Boyko, shown in blue in this map of the 2019 election, the oligarch Poroshenko, and the pro-Western former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, as shown in pink and purple, who was Tymoshenko was tainted by corruption allegations, which had led to her being jailed under Yanukovych, despite the fact that these allegations were clearly politically motivated. But by 2019, the electorate clearly wanted someone new, so Zelensky fitted the bill. Now, Putin reacted to these events by ordering the invasion of the Crimean Peninsula and the eastern provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, where armed conflict continues today. On the face of it, Russia had no justification for invading a sovereign state on its borders. But Ukraine had not been an independent sovereign state for very long. The early modern period, shown here, Ukraine began to emerge from the breakup of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Through most of the 18th and 19th centuries, it was part of Tsarist Russia. And then with the Bolshevik Revolution, which overthrew the Tsar and his regime, and after a brief interval in which Russia had been ruled by relatively liberal politicians, notably Alexander Kerensky. There was a brief civil war, and after this, Ukraine became part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But in World War II, it changed hands again. Most of the western part was under German occupation from 1941 to 1944, before reverting to Soviet control in 1945 with the overthrow of Nazism. In 1954, the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, ceded the Crimea to Ukraine. So it's 1954. He'd actually been the Soviet commissar in Ukraine before and after the war. Since then, Putin's Russia has reabsorbed the Crimean Peninsula along with parts of southeastern Ukraine. Those has not at all been internationally recognized. So, what are the historical roots and antecedents of the present conflict? Almost as soon as Vladimir Putin's forces invaded Ukraine, political pundits and others began comparing him with Hitler. It's not a terribly good likeness, but all you need to represent Hitler is just a little toothbrush moustache and a slick of dark hair. And you know who it is, one of the most instantly recognizable historical figures. Both men, Hitler and Putin, had imposed dictatorial rule over their respective countries. Both men suppressed dissent and eliminated independent media. Both men had no hesitation in murdering people they considered a threat to their rule. Both Hitler and Putin invaded a series of neighboring countries. Both used lies and disinformation to justify their actions. Both used a symbol, in Putin's case, Z, as you can see at the top, on the side of that tank. In Hitler's case, of course, the swastika, to advertise support for their aims. Both men had no hesitation in causing death and destruction on a massive scale to further their ends. Jonathan Katz, the Washington-based director of democracy initiatives, has said that Putin is this country's equivalent to Hitler. This century's equivalent to Hitler. Putin's character disturbingly mirrors traits of Hitler's. For me, the former director of US National Intelligence, James Clapper, told CNN, Putin is a 21st century Hitler, a phrase used by a variety of commentators, ranging from the former Irish Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, to the Ukrainian Minister of Defense. The British Liberal Democrat politician Norman Baker claimed in the Daily Mail that everything Vladimir Putin does echoes Adolf Hitler. Even the Prince of Wales, as he was then, now King Charles III, speaking to a Jewish Holocaust survivor in Canada in 2014 after the Russian invasion of the Crimea, said Putin is doing just about the same as Hitler. Critics of the West's cautious approach to Putin's territorial aggrandizements invoke parallels with the Munich Agreement of 1938, in which Britain and France sought to appease Hitler and even avert a general war by forcing Czechoslovakia, as it was then, to give in to the Nazi dictator's demands for a large chunk of their country. Now, of course, as Jewish groups have pointed out, Putin has not established extermination camps or gas chambers, as Hitler did, to carry out the mass murder of European Jews. But Ukraine's President Zelensky has directly called the indiscriminate bombardment of his country's major towns and cities a genocide. Poland's President Andrzej Duda echoed this by asserting that the Russian invasion, he said, bears the features of a genocide. It aims at eliminating and destroying a nation. The mounting evidence of indiscriminate massacres of civilian men, women and children by the retreating Russian armies in Bucha and other Ukrainian towns is impossible to ignore, despite risible Russian efforts to do so. Genocide, seems to me, this undoubtedly is, in the sense that these people are being killed because they're Ukrainians and for no other reason. And genocide, of course, was at the heart of the Nazi project in the 1930s and early 40s. Adopted as the official policy of the German government in 1942, the Nazis' general plan for the East, proposal for the mass murder by disease, starvation, neglect, and what they called extermination through labor of up to 45 million Slavs in order to make way for German settlement across East Central Europe, laid bare the full extent of the most radical genocidal program ever devised. Over the next 30 years, assuming a German victory in the war, the Nazis proposed to liquidate, as they put it, 50% of Estonians, Czechs and Russians under German control, 75% of Belarusians, 85% of Lithuanians and Poles, and 100% of Latgalians, a small ethnic minority in Latvia. The Ukrainians were to disappear altogether. 35% of them, deemed racially suitable, were to be Germanized. The rest, 65%, were to be eliminated. The German Reich and its satellite areas were to extend, according to the plan, deep into Central Europe and beyond, well into Eastern Europe on the boundaries of Asia. Fortunately, of course, the plan never had a chance of becoming a reality, but the genocidal attitude of the Nazis towards the millions they regarded as Slav subhumans found expression in the killing of thousands of Polish intellectuals, the deliberate starvation of more than 3.25 million Red Army soldiers taken prisoner in the initial advance of the German armies, penned into huge enclosures on the East European plains and left to die without food, shelter, or medication. Anyone who thinks the Ukrainians are Nazis or that Stalin, rather than Hitler, was a principal enemy of the Ukrainians and other inhabitants of East Central Europe needs to read this shocking document. Of course, Stalin also ordered the shooting of some 40,000 Polish officers at Katyn, captured when the Red Army took over eastern Poland in fulfillment of the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed in August 1939, and deported many thousands of mainly upper-class Poles to Siberia. But these terrible crimes were committed in the name of class warfare rather than ethnic hatred. The victims, of course, it in many ways didn't make a lot of difference. But the almost unimaginable scale of the general plan for the East puts it, I think, into a category of its own. However, of course, the Nazis' genocidal intentions went far beyond the elimination of so-called subhumans who stood in the way of German settlement. Genocide comes in many varieties, degrees, and forms, and the mass murder by the Nazis of nearly 6 million European Jews from every part of Europe, over which they had influence or control, was qualitatively different from the vast extermination program contained in the general plan for the East. From the very beginning, the Jews were, for the Nazis, the world enemy, dedicated to destroying Germany and the Germans in a huge global conspiracy aimed at ruling the world. Hitler believed that all Jews were predestined by their racial character, as he called it, to work towards this end. Nazi war propaganda expressed this bizarre paranoid conspiracy that powered Hitler's racial ideology, and it showed the three most powerful enemies of Germany during the war, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States of America, being steered from behind by malevolent Jewish conspirators. Here you have a caricature of Jew behind the enemy powers, the Jew, the Soviet Union, the United States, and the British Empire. It was this belief that led the German invaders of East Central Europe to go out of their way to degrade and humiliate the Jewish inhabitants of the area, forcing Jewish elders to dance in the town squares till they collapse from exhaustion, making Jewish girls clean latrines with their blouses, forcing Jewish people to scrub the roads with acid, and committing similar atrocities too revolting to detail. It was this belief that caused the Nazis to try and eliminate the Jewish population of Europe in the quickest way possible, in contrast to the longer-term mass extermination plan for the region's Slavs, which was people who were treated as subhumans, as the Nazis called them, but seldom treated with a grotesque and elaborate sadism reserved for the Jews. Now, in the light of these facts, few things in Putin's propaganda seem more absurd than his claim that Ukraine is ruled by a clique of Nazis, not least because President Zelensky is himself Jewish. That's not to say that there are not or have never been Nazis or fascists in Ukraine. In particular, a wartime partisan leader, Stepan Bandera, who fought against the Soviet Union's invasion of Ukraine during the war, was deeply anti-Semitic and fought against the Germans' invasion of Ukraine, was deeply anti-Semitic. He fought against the Soviets, fought against the Ukrainian, he fought against the Red Army, and fought against the Germans. Hence the Russian claim that they were invading, Putin's men were invading in order to combat Banderists, as he called them. And there is, of course, a far right in Ukraine. To its members, Bandera is a hero. One element in Ukrainian military resistance to the Russian invasion, the Azov Battalion, has its roots in an independent, ultra-right, pro-Nazi paramilitary movement. For these men, the Russians are the true enemy, most of all because of the deliberately induced famine of the early 1930s. Many on the Ukrainian right, including the pro-Western government since 2014, have attempted to give the famine equal status with the Holocaust by providing it with a similar-sounding name, the Holodomor, and claiming its victims numbered 6 million or even more. It's appalling enough, but the generally agreed figure seems to be 2 to 3 million. Since the war began, the Ukrainian government has taken steps to swamp the neo-Nazi element in the Azov battalion. It's now reckoned about 20%, while the battalion itself has been placed under strict military supervision by the Ukrainian state, and of course it's only one small element in the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainians' fight for survival, it's important to remember, is a fight for democracy, a fight for the Ukrainian people's right of self-determination. It's a fight against a regime in Russia that's extinguished the small green shoots of democracy that emerged in 1990. It's crushed civil rights, free expression, independent news media, and all political opposition. Putin has imprisoned and killed oppositional figures like Alexei Navalny and sent agents abroad to murder critics who have fled the country. He controls the media and does not permit any public criticism. Putin's regime emerged out of the unrestrained greed of the transition from communism to capitalism in the 1990s, a transition that created the billionaires we know as oligarchs. It's an ultra-capitalist regime, a kleptocracy that's corrupt to the core. It's a system that found imitation in the corruption that riddled the Ukrainian political system after independence, in which Zelensky is now attempting to combat. Here you see a chart of Zelensky's attempts to eliminate the corruption that was so endemic, creating institutions and legal measures to try and combat it. Unlike Hitler, Putin does not think of Ukrainians as subhumans who have no right to remain alive, let alone a malignant global threat to the existence of his country. There's a great joke Jewish joke from the Warsaw Ghetto, in which an old Jew gets onto a tram and sees his friend there reading a Nazi newspaper, the Völkische Beobachter. And he says, Moshe, why are you reading that? Why are you reading that paper? It's a Nazi paper. And his friend looks up at him and says, just once a week I buy it to be assured that I and we Jews rule the world. We're in control of it. It has a kind of bitter edge that the best Warsaw Ghetto jokes have. On the 18th of March, 2014, celebrating the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine, Putin declared that Russians and Ukrainians are, and he said, we are one people. And Kiev, he went on, harking back to the Middle Ages, is the mother of all Russian cities. So it's a rather feeble pun here, but this sort of describes his view. In February 2020, he repeated his belief that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people, he said. He alleged that Ukrainian national identity was the creation of malign foreign influence. There was no Ukrainian state, it was a fiction. It followed that apart from the tiny minority of Nazis who ruled them, Ukrainians would welcome the Russians with open arms as they liberated them from foreign occupation. So Russian military conscripts were not prepared in advance for the invasion, and they were quickly disillusioned as they encountered unexpectedly stiff resistance from the Ukrainians. Since the invasion, they've made only very slow progress in some border regions and none at all in others. In some locations, they've been beaten back by Ukrainian forces. In others, they've continued to advance almost inch by inch. Civilians in occupied towns and villages have come out with Ukrainian flags to demonstrate against the invaders. Artillery bombardments and airstrikes have inflicted massive damage on the physical fabric of many Ukrainian towns and cities, but they don't seem to have weakened Ukrainian resistance. If anything, they've strengthened it. NATO and the EU, bystanders when Russia occupied the Crimean Peninsula and the eastern borderland provinces of Ukraine, have surprised Putin by taking strong and concerted action to impose severe sanctions that are already having a damaging effect on the Russian economy following the invasion of 2022. They've made major efforts to keep Ukrainian armed forces supplied with weapons and equipment. The expected swift occupation of the entire country, followed by the rapid removal of Zelensky and his replacement by a Russian puppet, has not happened. For Putin and his regime, this is a military and political defeat of humbling proportions. Russian forces recognized this embarrassing reality and withdrew from central Ukraine to consolidate their position in the eastern provinces. Here their task is easier. If you look at a linguistic map here of Ukraine, you'll see the eastern provinces are dominated by Russian speakers, unlike the central and western parts, where speakers of Ukrainian dominate. And Ukrainian is not a dialect of Russian, it's a separate language more closely related to Belarusian, with a distinct grammar and spelling, which we have, for example, we've all had to learn by speaking Kiev the Ukrainian rather than the Russian way. Odessa with one S, not two, and so on. As a result of decades of domination by Russia, many, if not most, Ukrainians can speak Russian, but there's no doubt they have a distinctive cultural identity. An identity, of course, that Putin is determined to obliterate by all means possible in the eastern provinces. It is perhaps here, if anywhere, that the parallel with Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union can be found. But Hitler also expected an easy, swift victory. He sent his armies, an enormous force numbering more than 3.5 million men, with thousands of tanks, self-propelled guns, armoured vehicles, combat aircraft and artillery, across the borders of Nazi-occupied Poland on 22nd of June 1941. So confident was Hitler that the entire edifice of Soviet society, which he conceived of as a kind of vast mass of ignorant and subhuman Slavic peasants ruled by a tiny clique of manipulative but unpopular Jewish Bolsheviks, would collapse, that he didn't even bother to equip the troops with winter clothes. At first, his confidence appeared to be justified. Along a 1,000-mile front, the German and Allied armies advanced at breakneck speed, encircling and capturing or killing hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers. Hitler and his generals were euphoric. It's really not saying too much, Franz Halder, chief of the German Army Supreme Command, noted in his diary on the 3rd of July 1941, if I claim that the campaign against Russia has been won in 14 days. But Halder and his master had miscalculated. As Ukrainian peasants greeted the invading troops with the traditional welcome offerings of bread and salt, expecting liberation from the horrors of Stalin's rule, they were met with more horrors as the Germans looted and burned their way through the countryside, reduced towns to rubble, and met even minor acts of resistance with mass executions and the torching of entire villages. Soon, heartened by Stalin's abandonment of Bolshevik rhetoric to call on people to fight the Germans in the spirit of Russian patriotism, partisan groups are springing up everywhere. Stalin's generals mobilized military reservists and brought them to the front. By early August 1941, General Halder was confessing to his diaries, "We have underestimated the Russian colossus." The Soviets, unlike the Germans, seemed to have limitless reserves of men and equipment. Reinforcements kept on arriving to take the place on the battlefront of the hundreds of thousands killed or captured. And worse was to come for the Germans. When the autumn rains arrived in 1941, their armies became bogged down in oceans of mud. Soon the Russian winter was beginning to bite, with temperatures plunging to 40 degrees below zero. Such was Hitler's overweening confidence, born of his continuing contempt for Slav subhumans, as he regarded them, that he ignored all these problems. Never before, he said on the 8th of November 1941, has a giant empire been smashed and struck down in a shorter time than Soviet Russia. But he was living in a fantasy world. His troops were exhausted after months of continual advance. They were ill-equipped for a winter campaign. Their numbers were depleted by continual counterattacks launched by the Red Army. Disaster now loomed when the Soviet general, Georgy Zhukov, bringing fresh reserves across from the east, launched a counterattack. Germans were forced back. In the terrible winter conditions, German troops began to freeze to death in their thin summer uniforms. Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, launched a massive campaign to get German civilians to send winter clothing to the beleaguered army as the winter aid program of the German people, 1940-41. But it was too late. Under the strain of defeat, one senior German general after another suffered a heart attack or collapse in health and resigned, including Hitler himself. Hitler regarded anything other than uncompromising resistance to the advancing Russians as cowardice in the face of the enemy. Any general who ordered a strategic or even a tactical withdrawal in the interests of preserving the lives of his troops was met with instant dismissal. Furious with his senior officers, Hitler took over as Commander-in-Chief of the army himself. The following months in 1942 saw the Germans advance once more in the east, but it was a false dawn. In the winter of 1942 to 43, the Battle of Stalingrad sealed their fate and inaugurated a whole process of continuous retreat that ended only in 1945 with the Soviets occupying Berlin and Hitler committing suicide. And this week, of course, we are commemorating the end of World War II, the end with a complete defeat of the German Reich. Both Hitler and Putin were encouraged in their deadly illusions by subordinates who in neither case, did not utter a word of criticism of their policies. This may be because the fear of the consequences of disagreeing with their master. For Hitler, anyone, especially a leading general, who disputed his policy of never giving an inch to the enemy was likely to find himself cashiered from the army and deprived of his pension. Both dictators surrounded themselves not just with fearful yes-men, but also with true believers, men who'd long since surrendered any independence of judgment and just acted as an echo chamber for their leaders' views. In the case of both Putin and Hitler, ideology, Russian nationalist conviction of the essentially Russian character of Ukrainians in the first case, a dogmatic belief in the superiority of the so-called Aryan race in the second, created an overconfidence that led to humiliating military defeat. Both cases, an invasion that was supposed not to meet any serious resistance turned into a catastrophe. In both cases, a dictator acted on ideologically driven assumptions that quickly turned out to be false. Both Hitler and Putin projected their own murderous beliefs onto those they imagined to be their enemies. Hitler and Goebbels justified the Holocaust, for example, by repeatedly alleging that Jews were aiming to exterminate the German race. Well, Putin and his subordinates have justified his assault on Ukraine by repeatedly claiming that the Nazis in the country's leadership were aiming to carry out a genocide of the Russians in the Danube region, the Donbass region on the east. But there I think the resemblance ends. To judge from his speeches over the past few years, Putin, who regards the collapse of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 1990s as a national disaster, wants to recreate the Russia of his early years and reabsorb into it a neighboring state and other parts of East Central Europe that he believes have no right to an independent existence. He is evidently prepared to use any means he considers necessary to achieve his goal. One sign of this was the Russian invasion of independent Georgia in 2008, sparking a crisis that remains unresolved despite a negotiated ceasefire. At the moment, at least, the conflict in general, the wider conflict, seems confined to one part of Europe, the aims of the invasion limited, even shrinking, as Putin seems to have abandoned his idea of enforcing regime change in Ukraine. Putin seems to have abandoned the idea, is opting for the division of the country instead. As the breadth and depth of Ukrainian national consciousness have become clear, Putin and his troops have come to believe that the Nazis, as they claim to be fighting, are not just a tiny clique, but virtually the whole people. Still, the mass murder of civilians seems to be a product of defeat and retreat. It was not planned in advance, unlike the mass murder of Ukrainians and other so-called Slavs by the invading Germans in World War II. Hitler's aims, in contrast to Putin's, were not confined to one corner of Europe. He was never interested in just reversing the territorial settlement achieved by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, not interested in just in establishing German hegemony over the rest of the continent, although he claimed to be doing so after he came to power. His aim, as suggested in this famous scene from Chaplin's film, The Great Dictator, released in 1940, was global. Addressing his followers on 5th of November 1930 in the Rhenish town of Mannheim, after his stunning success in September's national elections, Hitler lamented the fact that in the scramble for Africa in the 1880s, Britain and France had snapped up the lion's share, leaving only the leftovers to the newly minted empire. And here I quote Hitler's speech. "No people," he said, "have more right than to the concept of ruling the world," and used the word Weltherrschaft, "than the German people. We would have had this right and no other nation." Stormy applause is recorded. "Not England, not Spain, not Holland, no other nation could have had an inborn right on the basis of its energy and competence and also its numerical strength to claim the domination of the world. In the first division of the world, we fell short," meaning the 1880s. "But we stand now at the beginning of a new great shake-up of this world. Today, some people claim we are entering an age of peace. But I have to say to them, gentlemen, you have a poor understanding of the horoscope of our times, which points as never before not to peace, but to war." And that's in 1930, several months before he came to power. For Hitler, the invasion of the Soviet Union was only a step in the direction of world domination, as its vast resources would form the basis for even further invasions, including ultimately, as he hinted in his unpublished sequel to Mein Kampf, the United States. Perpetual war without limit of time or space, was, he believed, the only way for the Germans, the Aryans, to use his racist terminology, to succeed in the struggle for existence between races for the survival of the fittest. It's really essential to understand the vast nature and unlimited nature of Hitler's aims. Putin's aims are far more limited. He is driven by a committed and misdirected nationalism that wants to reverse the territorial settlement of the early 1990s and re-establish Russia in the ranks of the great powers. His beliefs are based on a bizarrely twisted view of history that sees anyone who tries to frustrate them as a Nazi, to be killed just as the Nazis were by the Red Army in the Second World War. Both Hitler and Putin are consumed by a deeply held ideology rooted in false memories or manufactured memories of World War. Hitler believed the German nation had been betrayed by socialists and Jews who stabbed the army in the back in World War I. He was committed from the outset to reversing that defeat and resuming Germany's grasp for world power, though on a far larger scale than before, eliminating the Jewish world enemy being a precondition for success. Putin believes the Russian nation was betrayed by leaders who weakly abandoned integrity after 1917 and again after 1989, and he too is committed to reversing what he imagines to be historic defeats. Genocide is a result in both cases. The fact that Hitler was planned and Putin's not doesn't take away any of the horror that's happening on the ground in Ukraine today. And what has Europe's response been? Many countries in East Central Europe fear that the Russians will try to take them over. And as we saw at the beginning of the lecture, have joined NATO or the EU. The more aggressive Russia has grown, the more necessary membership in NATO has seemed to such countries. It's Russia that's provoking a response here, not, as some have claimed, the other way around. And there's no credence at all in the view that put forward by Russian propagandists that the invasion of Ukraine is a response to the eastward expansion of NATO. It's the other way around, as it were. Meanwhile, the Russian economy is entering a recession under the impact of international sanctions, with high inflation and interest rates and a dramatic slowdown of growth. But it's important to note that many countries in the world support Russia, like China or India, the world's two largest countries in terms of population, will remain neutral in the conflict. Since his inauguration earlier this year, US President Donald Trump has abruptly scaled down his support from Ukraine in what I think is a naive belief that he could bring about a deal with Russia. He seems unaware of the strength of Ukrainian nationalism, which is unwilling to contemplate the partition of the country, or the political determination of President Putin, who needs a continuing nationalist war to distract the Russian population from the dire economic situation in which they find themselves, and has shown a persistent unwillingness to negotiate a settlement, least of all one that would be acceptable to the Ukrainians. This kind of plan or proposal for the division of the country would simply not be acceptable to either side. US administration has hinted it will wash its hands of the conflict if it fails to achieve a resolution, showing its naivety and incompetence in the world of international conflict and diplomacy, where the art of the deal is proving a lot more difficult than it is in American business. Trump has now concluded an agreement with Ukraine that gives a share of its mineral resources to the Americans, but that will also mean an American presence on the ground for the mineral extraction, and will bind the USA into a de facto alliance. The war, I think, is likely to continue indefinitely. And Putin's experience with Ukraine makes it unlikely, in my view, that he will try to invade other countries. It's just been too difficult. And in the end, supposed parallels with Hitler do not, I think, tell us very much. Thank you very much.
Richard, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating and stimulating exposition. I'm going to abuse my position perhaps by asking the first question, but first of all, just a request to everyone that we've got a very big audience, we've got a limited amount of time. So number one, just a single question each, and please limit the follow-ups, and please questions, not speeches. There will be, when we go on to the more general questions, my favourite toy, the catch mic, passing amongst you. It is soft, it is padded. Please feel free, if you want to move it to the next person asking a question, to throw it around the room. It's perfectly safe. It won't or shouldn't break. But please wait for the mic to arrive with you before asking your question, if called upon, because that is the way in which people viewing online will be able to hear what the heck you're saying. So, Richard, one thing that struck me whilst you were speaking was that if we think about Soviet Cold War experience, one of the things that several of us have discerned there was a fear of encirclement. And I wonder how far some of Putin's attitude might be said to be rooted in that historically grounded fear that the West was trying to encircle his state. And do you think that's part of what's going on in his view?
Well, I'm not sure encirclement is correct, because the Soviet Union, as does present-day Russia, extended it was far too big a country to be encircled. And of course, that was a standard tactic of the German armies in World War II. Time and again, they encircled huge numbers of Soviet troops of the Red Army, and that's, I think, not something that's possible now. But on the other hand, of course, he does see the West in some way as the aggressor, although he claims to see that. There's always a question about how far he actually believes in the propaganda he's pumping out. But certainly that's his line, that NATO and the EU are pushing ever further to the east and will eventually kind of arrive at Russia and start to try and destroy it.
Now, who's going to go first with the catch mic? Chris?
You're speaking to this, is that right?
Yes.
Thanks, Richard. That was great, and I really liked your closing section of the talk, where you kind of tamped down enthusiasm for the Putin-Hitler comparison. Because I agree, I think it's hermeneutically empty. It is great for releasing emotions, but it's just not analytically very, very helpful. But I wondered if you think this. I was going to try something out, and that is whether you think that perhaps we're still a bit enthralled to the 20th century. We're always looking for 20th century comparisons, whereas what you told us about Putin suggests that actually the 19th century and even the 18th century are more important to him. He talks a lot about Peter the Great, a bit less, but sometimes about Catherine, and certainly about the conquests of her era. Nicholas I is the Tsar he most resembles, it seems to me, in terms of his domestic policy and his external policy. What do you think? Do you think that's a viable alternative view?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting, Chris. Putin, I was very struck when I went to Russia a few years ago of how Putin is trying to suppress any kind of negative or critical aspects of the Russian past going way back. It's not just Stalin who he's in fact rehabilitating, but earlier leaders as well. And he does see himself in a Russian nationalist way as in a long continuity of national leaders. And he went to the Peter Paul Fortress, for example, trying to, in St. Petersburg, trying to find the prison cells in which various Russian dissidents had been imprisoned, starting with Lenin, and they were all closed. You couldn't go into them at all. And of course, through school textbooks and teaching, he is trying to, like many dictators do, in fact, and we can see Donald Trump about to start doing the same thing, to build this positive, uncritical view of the past.
Charlotte.
Thank you, and thank you very much for that really thought-provoking talk. And I particularly enjoyed the propaganda posters and that interrogation of the use of language and the myth-making about the past. And I was wondering, in terms of thinking about dissent, is there any parallel to be drawn either between Hitler and Putin, or Putin and other leaders, in terms of an attempt to be impervious to that sort of criticism, or a detachment from reality that is perhaps making life difficult for Putin because of his detachment from how things really are on the ground for the soldiers. So I'm asking really whether there's any parallel to be drawn to Hitler in terms of a refusal to see or a sort of an entourage that is protecting him from some of the reality of the dissent or public opinion that is against him.
Yes, I think in the sense that both dictators, like almost all dictators, do not want any criticism that easily spills over into not wanting any advice, because they see that as, in some sense, a form of criticism. So that is a real danger, I think, of dictatorships. You don't get the right advice. You surround yourself by yes men, and it's usually, in Putin's case, it's men, and Trump's case, it's women as well. You don't get the kind of advice that you don't get people saying, oh, calm down, don't do this at all. Everything goes. So I think that's right. I mean, I did at one point play with the idea that, Putin, of course, has sent out agents into other countries to murder his critics who found refuge there. But then there are examples of Hitler doing that as well. I think of Theodor Lessing, for example, a liberal philosopher who was assassinated by Nazi agents outside Germany.
Charlotte, if we come straight in front of you, and then we'll come down to Vivian.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Very thought-provoking, and I won't give a lecture. Mike reminded us, but I could. I think I take issue with Chris. I don't think Putin is 19th or 18th century. Putin is very much 21st century. And that is a project which has been started ages ago. The mastermind is Vladimir Surkov, who created the figura of Putin. History is just one part of that.
Yeah.
And of course, the way they exploit it is absolutely amazing. They're fooling everyone. Everyone believes what he says. It's actually not the case. This is a facade, as we have had with Potemkin in the 18th century. There, I go back to the 18th. But it is very much a 21st century affair. And as we know from the propaganda influence in the West, not least Donald Trump's election, it's successful. It's working better than we think. And I think we need to contextualize that in the tradition of the propaganda state of the Soviet Union. Because Russians, since the Bolshevik Revolution, indeed, they can go back to the 16th century with the Third Rome and all of that, have lived in a propaganda-fed situation. And they've never been weaned of that. And Putin continues that in the 21st century style. And I mean, you showed us some of the fact that they quote the Second World War, something that everyone knows in Russia, makes it so familiar. It makes it look absolutely normal, and natural. And that's why in Russia nobody, or very few people, actually question what's going on.
That's right, yes. I mean, actually, I recall, Hubertus, you telling me a story about how you were present at the Russian invasion of Georgia.
Yeah, I was there.
It interrupted your wedding, as I recall. How daring of them. But, yeah, I mean, you have to ask the question, how is it possible for people in a dictatorship of some kind to have access to alternative information rather than the misinformation that the dictator and his minions are pumping out? And in Nazi Germany, for example, it was quite difficult because you had there weren't very many radios, and Goebbels, the propaganda minister, had a cheap radio receivers manufactured, but he manufactured them to make sure that you couldn't get foreign radio stations on those. Though some people were just able to tune into Radio Luxembourg, you didn't get much significant information there. So, and again, Putin, Russia is a vast country, and it's very difficult for Russians to get any other kind of information. If you listen, if you remember Mikhail Gorbachev, who was overthrown temporarily in a coup and sort of confined to one small place. When he was released, he was asked how he got information about what was going on, and he said BBC. But I think that's got more difficult now. And of course, the corruption of Russian media has been an important part of that. There's a very interesting work by Peter Pomerantsov, who was a former Russian game show producer, about the kind of corruption, undermining of Russian media. I was asked, I agreed to give an interview in Cambridge to a Russian TV team which wanted to know about Hitler and the Nazis. So they came, a sort of very glamorous woman came in with a little team and started asking questions like, this is all right, you know. And then it began to kind of veer off into things like, what about the train of gold in the Polish tunnel? Or why did the Nazis spend so much time looking for the Holy Grail and so on? Which I said, oh, well, try watching the Indiana Jones movie. So in the end, I asked her, when they'd stopped, finished, why you are indulging all these crazy conspiracy theories? And she just said, well, of course they are crazy, but our audience like it.
So if we go 1, 2, 3, and then I've got a fourth up there.
Could I ask a question about propaganda? Because it seems to be a big difference between Germans in 1941, who regard Ukraine and all that is there almost as an empty space. It's empty with people by subhumans almost, or other people. And the propaganda that one gets, for instance, in the Moscow metro with the wonderful mosaics of happy Ukrainians greeting their Soviet friends when they agree to join and so on. And of course the big one about the religious element of Kiev as in a sense being proto-Moscow in terms of religion. So could you care to comment about the propaganda element?
It's slightly difficult to figure out what you want me to comment on exactly, but I think certainly, I mean, there are similarities and differences, obviously. Control over the media is very, very important one. Goebbels was a very intelligent man, and he knew that you couldn't pump out propaganda all the time. So he had lots of popular programs of music, request programs, and that kind of thing. But if you were caught during the war listening to a foreign radio station, you could be shot. It was a treasonable offence. Again, it's more difficult, I think, for Russians. I mean, Hubertus will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's more difficult for Russians now to listen to foreign radio stations. It's simply a question of distance apart from anything else. Of course, you might think that nowadays social media are universally accessible, but that it simply isn't the case. You can shut down and ban social media or restrict their broadcasting. So I think there are differences. I mean, the question that interests me, in a way, is how far do dictators and their minions believe in their own propaganda? And that's a really difficult one to answer. I think Hitler certainly did believe in his own propaganda. Goebbels was rather more cynical about it and thought, I mean, he knew when he was lying, put it like that. I think Donald Trump has no idea at all whether he's telling the truth or not.
When you were coming close to your conclusion in the end, one of the main parallels between Putin and Hitler you were drawing was that Hitler basically had the imagination to conquer the whole world without any stopping point, whereas Putin tries to restore the former Soviet Union but doesn't want to continue further. And you mentioned one of the main reasons for that is the terrible experience he has made in Ukraine and the fierce resistance that came unexpected. The question is, history, especially recent history, has also shown that the only thing Putin really respects is strength. So in case he deems another country that is not in the scope of the former Soviet Union but considered weak enough, would you still keep your kind of your point of view that if it was not part of the former empire of Russia or the Soviet Union, he would not be interested in that? Or do you think at some point the power and the strength he currently has and maybe successes in the past would make him greedy and continue further even if it was not kind of in the Soviet Union space? Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that Putin's Russia is not a particularly strong power. He wants to make it strong again, but that's proving very, very difficult. He's got huge economic problems with very high inflation, sanctions biting, and all the rest of it. And in a way, his opinions are formed by World War II. In which Russia was victorious, and he simply sees himself as kind of wanting to repeat that, but only on a relatively limited scale. If you go back to Stalin's doctrine was socialism in one country. He abandoned the Leninist view that communism could spread across the world and decided, as a result of experience in the 1920s, that was not on. He just had to build a communist society in his own country. Whereas Hitler's experience was of World War I, where he believed, in common with the vast majority of Germans, that that Germany was going to win. And so the shock of Germany losing had to be explained by this paranoid stab-in-the-back theory, and he could regroup and have another war again. There's no doubt in my mind he intended a European world war from the very beginning, even before he came to power. That speech from 1930 I quoted, I think, demonstrates that. So his aims and ambitions were far, far greater than those of Putin. I know there are some historians who disagree with that and will want to play up the danger of the invasion of Poland. But at the moment, that seems to be very difficult. He can't even conquer Ukraine, and Poland will be a far tougher proposition.
It's good to take the Regis by surprise.
I just tackled the Regis. I'm so sorry. Richard, thank you. Could we come back to the Holodomor? You mentioned it in passing, and I think the implication was that it really came nowhere close in terms of intent or scale to the Holocaust. For most Ukrainians, there must be quite a few here, that is probably not the case. I think even in 2003, the assumption in Ukraine was that it's between 7 and 10 million. You're absolutely right that the numbers have been downscaled since then. I think Timothy Snyder, people like this, think it's more between 3.5 and 5 million. But the idea is still that this was a genocide, and this was not, as you said, perhaps class war, but really an attempt, certainly later on, by the end of 1933, to punish the Ukrainian people with a famine. And the question really is this: are we, as European historians, and not all of you are, of course, but maybe these two here, and you as a German historian, are we perhaps still too wedded to the idea of German uniqueness and incomparability? I'm not trying to sound like Ernst Nolte here at all, but maybe the time has come to accept more comparability.
Yeah, I know there are, comparison doesn't mean saying it's the same thing. I'm not sure about this innovation.
You're quite safe.
Seems to be highly dangerous. Look, as I explained, the Holocaust is born of a paranoid conspiracy theory held by the Nazis, according to which all Jews all over the world were engaged in a massive conspiracy to destroy Germany and Western civilization. You cannot say that about any other genocide. All other genocides have been aimed at clearing away some rival group for some reason or another, whether it's in Rwanda or, as I suggested, even in Ukraine today. And I think there's a current tendency among some historians to argue, for example, that the Holocaust was like a continuation of colonial policies, like in Germany destroying the Herreros in the German colony, as it was then, of what's now Namibia, before World War I. But the Germans were not claiming that the Herreros in Namibia were engaged in a worldwide plot to destroy Germany. They were simply regarded as inferior beings, and I think there's a crucial difference there. Hence, this desire of German troops to humiliate Jews that they encountered in Eastern Europe. If you look at Stalin's mass murder of 2-3 million, I mean, it's very difficult to pin down, Ukrainians. This was part of a campaign he waged to collectivize agriculture, and he met with massive resistance from farmers, peasant farmers, and responded with really extreme mass murder to get them out of the way. I think that is a kind of class warfare. It's not racist in intention. And one way of showing that is that simultaneously he was also destroying small farmers in Kazakhstan, for example, and these important grain-producing areas which he needed to get control over in order to subsidize his industrialization and to provide food for new industrial cities. So I think there are, I don't want to minimize or play down the suffering of Ukrainians in the early 1930s, and there's a huge amount of evidence for that. But I do think they're qualitatively different, and I think it's important to remember that.
Time probably for one more, and you've been quite patient up there.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the talk. It was very enlightening. I'm glad that the person before me actually asked the question in the vein that he asked it, in the sense that we are currently in a discussion of trying to compare genocidal dictators without actually perhaps comparing or actually even talking about the biggest genocide which is taking place currently on this earth, which is the conflict in Palestine, the conflict in Gaza, and what the Israeli government is doing. So my question, just to put it very short, obviously I can perhaps list a number of things to say that why...
Keep it short, we're really tight on time.
Yeah, so perhaps I can list a number of things to say that why the comparison between Netanyahu and his government and Hitler is perhaps a much more fruitful comparison than the one between Putin and Hitler. So I just wanted to ask you a very simple question, is that do you accept the premise of that comparison, and do you are you aware of the things that are going on in Gaza and what Israel is doing?
Sure, of course I'm aware of it. The current government of Israel is a right-wing extremist government that is committing war crimes on a horrendous nature. And now it seems to have emerged that Netanyahu and his right-wing allies, extreme nationalist allies like Smotrich and Ben Gvir in the Israeli cabinet, want to completely empty Gaza. These are war crimes of huge dimensions. That's not, I mean, on the other hand, of course, Hamas is, in my view, a terrorist organization that has also committed war crimes. What's driving them both, I think, is religious extremism. It's a belief of people like Smotrich that God has given more or less the whole of that region of the Middle East to the Israelis. Smotrich, I've seen videos of Smotrich lecturing in front of a map of the Middle East where Israel includes Jordan, Lebanon and so on. I think these again these are different from the Holocaust. You can leave aside the question of how far the Holocaust might justify the existence of Israel. It certainly does not justify, in my view, the policies pursued by the current Israeli government. And Jewish friends of mine have been on demonstrations against Netanyahu in Israel, so far without very much success, unfortunately. While this continues, there's not much chance of peace. I don't think there's a sense it's a moot point as to how far Israeli policy in Gaza is a genocide, because he's not, the Israeli government is not proposing to kill all of the Arabs or kill them because they're Arabs, which is a crucial point. But that doesn't in any way excuse the horrendous crimes that the Israeli Defense Force has been committing.
Thank you. We are out of time at this point, and we need to give Richard a break. I study a country which has a constitution that still, hopefully, continues to have a clause against cruel and unusual punishments, and having someone speak and then subject them to endless questions, I think, would be in that category. So it just falls to me briefly to say thank you very much, Richard. You've given us all a very great deal to think about. You have covered the impossible brief that our benefactor has given our speakers admirably in all of its respects. I suspect that Colonel Ramsay Murray would only have faulted you on one grounds, and you didn't say anything positive about rowing, which was a constant theme of his conversation. But on a serious note, thank you very, very much indeed. The parallels that you've drawn, the comparisons, the similarities, the contrasts that you have brought out have stimulated a fascinating Q&A, quite apart from anything else. So it just remains to thank you very much indeed.